Yes, you read that right. We are going to be fixing the bouncy and frankly basic suspension of both of these bikes here using an actual ram mount. Really. Just not this exact ram mount. Sorry, I know that's the clickbait out of the way, I promise, but we will actually be using a mount from Ram to help these forks withstand the weight of anyone over the age of 7. This is my Mototec 48 volt Pro, and right off the bat you can see there are two distinct features. It is cheap and it is intended for a child, and despite all appearances, I am a child. But Mototec didn't know that and didn't care to throw enough money at this, so we get a very bouncy bike, which if you saw my last video, then you know the bike reached its limits of capability and my limits to tolerate it. So it's time to upgrade, and we could have gone the traditional and quite frankly the expensive route, which would be something like getting Moto B1 forks for the front for some stiffer springs, and then maybe rounding out the rear with a D&M rear shock, which is all perfectly fine, don't get me wrong, those are great upgrades to get, but that would set me back at the very least a couple $100. And what I'm proposing today, about 8. And we're not just talking about the front forks here, I have something else up my sleeve for the rear end, which if it works is going to be totally free. For me anyway. Time to get into it, gut the front and the rear, and take a closer look at all this. It's interesting because on the surface, these components look pretty good and promising because the front forks are upside down forks. These are the norm for full-size, proper race bikes. And then the rear shock actually has a preload adjustment, which is all well and good, but if you look beyond that, these things don't hold up. Like the rear shock here, the spring is pretty thin and soft, and there's no adjustments whatsoever for anything like rebound or compression. In fact, it's not even fluid damped, it's filled with air. But thankfully, the forks do have fluid in them. The website says that it actually has 15 weight fork oil in it, which is pretty heavy to begin with, and I'm surprised by that given the way it feels, but I have some 20 weight laying around, and 20 is bigger than 15, right? Well, this might have something to do with the poor performance in the forks. This is how much oil I pulled out of just one side, one fork leg, and I checked the website. It actually does have oil capacity for these forks, and it says it's 140 milliliters, but with this one, this tick mark, the lowest one, which is above the line, is 100 milliliters. So that's one of two things here. Either the website is wrong and 140 milliliters is actually the total capacity, or this has been severely underfilled. So I think first what we're gonna do is actually open up the second fork and fill it up here and see if that totals 140, in which case that's how much I'm gonna put in of the 20 weight. I'm starting to think that my first theory was the correct one because I have just drained the second one and now the total is 125 milliliters. So I'm thinking that the website's just showing the total capacity, even though 125 is less than 140. That does make sense because I didn't let these things drain for an extended period of time, so there's still some residual oil inside of the forks, so I can see where that difference between 125 and 140 is made up. It's just in here, so the actual oil capacity I think is 70 milliliters per. And that's exactly how much I'm gonna put in of 20 weight. So we just got these two closed up, and it would have been nice to do one at a time, so that way we can see old oil versus new oil, but thankfully that's what a second Mototec is for. So I pulled the forks off of the old Mototec as well. So this one has been unchanged and just has whatever fork oil was in it, and this one has the new stuff. So now we can kind of see, pushing the two together, what the difference is. And I don't know if this is gonna show visually, but this one, being the old one with the old fork oil, is springing back up a lot quicker than this one. So that means this one has a little bit more rebound damping than the old one. And then feeling wise, I know that doesn't translate on video either, but this one feels like I'm having to apply just a little bit more pressure. This one, you can see that is a little springier. This one, a lot less. So that's a good sign. We can also help the rear shock as it sits by just adding some preload to it by tightening this bolt so it applies more pressure to the springs and make it a little bit stiffer. It's definitely not life-changing. It's not gonna change the spring rate or anything like that, but hey, it's better than nothing. So at the very least, with just some fork oil replacement and preload added to the rear, let's see how it feels just kind of as this is and see if that's any better. Rear's still a little saggy. Let's see, fronts though? Tiny bit better. It's still a little bouncy. Look at this, I can bunny hop it. So we'll call that stage 1 tune. It's a little bit improved, but not nothing. But that's not what you clicked on this video for. Let's get to the fun part. So a little background on how this fork works, as well as my thought process and how the ram mount comes into play, of course. So this is your basic fork, and there are some simple components to it. There's two outer portions. There's this gold piece. There's this one that kind of fits inside of it. And then inside this is actually the spring. On these forks, it's on the bottom here. And then on the inside of this chamber is a rod that connects to the bottom of this and kind of presses against against the spring and is connected and held in place at the very top at this cap. I actually went back to something that I saw way back in the day, back in 2015 when the OG Grom was brand new, and there was a forum that I frequented, and one of the first DIY mods that someone came up with was the fork mod, and I figured this could probably translate to the Mototec. Now when it came to the Grom, the fork mod, this cap was actually held on with a bolt on top and it was threaded into it, and then the thought process there was actually getting a bigger bolt with a sleeve to basically add some distance on this rod. So that's exactly what I am going to do here. So I guess it's finally time to reveal the ram mount that we're going to be putting in here, and it is this. It is a thread extension. So actually this is more of a mirror extension or a extension for another ram mount, but it is a ram mount nonetheless. Basically what this thing is just an extension of a threaded rod. So it has a male end and a female end that are the same thread pitch, and then this distance here is about 20 millimeters. So this will give it, give or take, 3/4 of an inch length added to this rod. This is going to go in between this threaded top and the red cap here, so it extends it. It's actually going to give this a little bit more travel, so it's going to push it out, make it a little bit taller, but the byproduct of that is that this is going to add more pressure onto the spring and give it more preload. It's basically the exact same thing that we just did for the rear shock. So we'll bring you in a little closer to see what we're actually doing here. This top cap is threaded on, so there's some threads right here, and then there's a little 14 millimeter that just kind of locks it into place. We're just going to loosen this so it gets all the way down to the bottom of the thread, so it bottoms itself out basically, and then we can use that as pressure to actually spin off this red cap, because this thing is on there pretty tight. I'm pretty sure there's Loctite on it, so it might be a bit of a pain. There we go. So we got the red cap here. It's got the threads on the outside to go to the gold piece, and then on the inside it's threaded right there. So this is our ram mount, and we're actually just going to thread this guy right into the top of this cap. Actually, I immediately take that back. I'm gonna first dab some thread locker onto it, then we can thread that thing back in there. And then we can thread our extended cap on here, and then we'll thread this guy up to the top to secure it in place. There we go. Inner rod extended. Final step, slide this guy up, spin it back on, and give it a tighten here, just enough to seal it. Done. Now we can take a look at these. I only did one, so we can compare. Can you tell which one I did? You can see this one, just based on the plastic, it's like right at the lip there, while this one is a little bit recessed. So I noticed with this one, the one that I didn't do, is that when you get to like halfway down the stroke and you're now on the bottom half, it's a little springy and it just kind of gives way. But this one, it's much harder. I think if anything else, this is not gonna bottom out with some hard impacts. Well, cool, we'll do the other one, slap it in the bike. But before we go throwing that in, a quick programming note, because if you're gonna be doing this yourself, you need to pay attention to this part. So in case you didn't know, Mototec actually has two different versions of their 48 volt Pro. There's an older V1 and the current V2. And as luck would have it, I actually have both of those versions. The all black bike that I have is a V1, whereas my pink bike is a V2. And you wouldn't really tell these differences, they're very subtle, but if you're looking at one right next to the other, you can kind of spot these differences, and unfortunately there are quite a few of those differences in the front forks. And when I was initially doing the research for this video to see what I could do, what kind of hardware I can get for these forks to see what's possible, I was looking at the V1 forks, because the V1 bike I don't care as much about, so if I mess something up with those forks, who cares? And that's how I discovered that the ram mount here, which has an M10 by 1.25 thread specifically, will work on the V1 forks. However, when I opened up the V2 forks, I found that this one has a different thread pitch. And so for whatever reason, the inner rod of the V2 fork has an M10 by 1.5 thread pitch, so it's a little bit coarser, which is really annoying because the M10 by 1.5 is kind of uncommon. Everyone else uses the M10 by 1.25. But thankfully, I actually found an eBay listing that makes a similar extension. It's even 20 millimeters, so it's gonna give the exact same length difference, but with an M10 1.5 thread pitch. And I'll link that eBay listing in the description below, so if you're gonna be doing this with a V2, make sure you get that one. And thankfully, you can tell which version of the forks you have by looking at the outside top cap. So So this one right here, which has the smaller bolt on top, this is the V1 cap. And then this one, which has a larger bolt with a little circle on the inside, this is the V2 cap. And I've since ordered a couple of those M10 by 1.5 thread extensions, but they're coming from China, so it's gonna take quite a while. So for the time being, we're gonna continue this video entirely with the V1 forks, the ones that will definitely take the ram mount.
Just a quick time lapse, since I didn't record video. Suspension better not collapse, but actually here's something you should know. Take it away, me.
Also, another tip, if you're doing forks, this is in general, if you are going to be breaking the top cap loose when it's inside of here, never ever have this thing tightened while you're doing it. Always loosen this thing first before you go breaking this loose or torquing it down, because it's clamping right there and it's clamping on the threads. And if you're actually trying to move the threads while it's clamped, you're gonna end up stripping that thing out. This is just aluminum. So I just have this one torqued down, then I can give this one a little tighten, and then we can tighten this thing up. But before we fully wrap things up, let's not forget about the rear here. So when it comes to modifying the rear, really the only option is just replacing this whole shock entirely with something else. Now, thankfully, there's lots of aftermarket options that are available, and some are better than others. There are some more quality products like D&M that I referenced earlier. There's also some cheaper options if you want to go that route with something like random eBay listings or even Amazon. However, I'm also going to be taking inspiration for the rear like I did with the front with the Honda Grom, and actually just taking from my Honda Grom. So I figured, why not just replace it with a stock Honda Grom shock? And the funny thing about the stock Honda Grom shock is that the Honda Grom is famously known for having soft suspension from the factory. However, in this case, I think it might be to its advantage here because of the weight difference. So a Honda Grom weighs something like 225 pounds, give or take. The Mototec, on the other hand, this is under 100, like 90 something. So this is gonna feel basically twice as stiff as it would be on the Grom. So I think this is actually gonna be the perfect spring rate. The other advantage to this, I think, is that the Grom shock is give or take about the same length, maybe just a little bit shorter than the stock one here, but that's okay. So it's gonna sit a little shorter in the rear, but I'd rather be it shorter than taller, because a lot of the other aftermarket options that are available, they kind of go for some of the bigger bikes as well, like the Talaria and the sur-ron. So they're much longer than the stock ones, and it gives the bike that weird stink bug look that everyone seems to have, which I absolutely hate. No offense to anyone that has a bike like that, but it looks so dumb. I'd rather this thing be a little squattier in the back than taller. Now, it is a little bit wider, so I did have to do some hackery to this on the inside bushing. I did have to shave this basically as flat as I possibly could. I also had to bend back the mounting tabs where the shock is actually attached to everything, just so it'll clear. It's very, very close, but I think it's gonna work. And now actually see if it did work. That is definitely stiffer. I don't think it has as much range. Wow, that feels solid. And with the front forks, that feels really good. Bounce test maybe? Well, since we didn't actually replace anything with the springs, we just made it a little bit longer and added some preload to it, so the front is still a little bouncy, but a lot better than it was, that's for sure. That rear though, that just feels solid. Now, as much as I would love to go out and test this thing at the scene of the crime, that endless washboard of a road, unfortunately right now it is a little bit too close for comfort in an active fire zone, and I definitely don't want to get in the way of CAL FIRE's efforts. But I think the evidence is clear in those side-by-sides that you just saw now that everything on here is much stiffer and much more accommodating for an oversized child like myself. Don't take that last sentence out of context. Now, if only the seat was a little bit more comfortable.